the most feared black men on death row, come with stories that shock and divide. Some were rightfully convicted for heinous crimes, while others were trapped by a system riddled with racial bias. Regardless of guilt or innocence, one thing must be clear: justice must be blind, fair, and equal for all. No exceptions at all. Let's look at the cases of the feared black men on death row. You may or may not have heard their name, but you have definitely encountered instances of injustice where race became a reason of fear more than the crime itself. Anthony Ray Hinton. What if I told you a man spent nearly 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit? That his only crime was being poor, black, and in the wrong place at the wrong time? This is the story of Anthony Ray Hinton, one of the most feared names on death row, not because of what he did, but because of what the system did to him. Anthony Ray Hinton wasn't a criminal. In fact, he was a regular 29-year-old guy from rural Alabama. He worked in a supermarket warehouse, lived at home with his mother, and minded his business. No criminal record, no trouble. Just an average man living a quiet life in a town just north of Birmingham. But in 1985, everything changed. Two fast food managers, John Davidson and Thomas Wayne Vason, were shot and killed in separate armed robberies. A third robbery was attempted, but the manager, Sidney Smotherman, survived. The police were under pressure. They needed a suspect. Fast. Smotherman picked Hinton's photo from a lineup, and that was enough to send the police knocking at his door. What happened next? Chilling. Detective Doug Acker, one of the men investigating the case, looked Hinton straight in the eye and said, "I don't care whether you did or didn't do it. In fact, I believe you didn't do it. But it doesn't matter. If you didn't do it, one of your brothers did. And you're going to take the rap." Let that sink in. Then he listed off the 5 reasons Hinton was going to prison. You're black. A white man says you shot him. You'll have a white district attorney, a white judge, and an all-white jury. That was the blueprint, and they followed it. Anthony's court-appointed lawyer didn't even believe him. Upon meeting him, the lawyer scoffed and said, "All y'all always doing something and saying you're innocent." That's the man who was supposed to fight for his freedom. His defense was weak. The only expert witness the lawyer could afford to call in was an elderly man with poor eyesight and no real credentials in ballistics. The prosecution tore him apart. Meanwhile, no physical evidence, not a fingerprint, not a footprint, nothing linked Hinton to the crime scenes. Their main piece of evidence, a claim that bullets found at the scenes matched a revolver in Hinton's mother's house. That's it. Not a single eyewitness, not a shred of forensic evidence, nothing placing Hinton at the murders. His boss even testified that Hinton was at work during the time of the killings. It didn't matter. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and locked away in a 5-by-7-foot cell for nearly 3 decades. Imagine sitting on death row for 30 years, knowing you're innocent, hearing the steel doors close, the lights go out, the footsteps pass by your cell, waiting for your name to be called for execution. Anthony Ray Hinton waited, and waited. He was laughed at, ignored, forgotten, until the Equal Justice Initiative, led by lawyer Brian Stevenson, picked up his case years later. New experts proved that the bullets absolutely did not match the revolver. Finally, in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously overturned his conviction. After 30 years, he walked out of prison a free man, but forever changed. But Hinton never let hatred consume him. He forgave the very system that nearly killed him. He wrote a memoir titled "The Sun Does Shine," and today he speaks out against injustice. Anthony Ray Hinton may have been labeled a monster on death row, but the truth? He was a victim of one of the most horrifying failures of justice in American history. Troy Anthony Davis. Troy Anthony Davis was just 20 years old when his name became entangled in one of the most controversial murder cases in American criminal history. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1968, Davis found himself at the center of a high-profile investigation following the tragic events of August 19, 1989. That night, Officer Mark McPhail, a 27-year-old off-duty policeman working a security shift at a Burger King, was shot and killed in the line of duty. He had intervened in a late-night altercation outside the restaurant, stepping in to protect a homeless man named Larry Young, who was being pistol-whipped in the parking lot. McPhail never even had a chance to draw his weapon. He was shot twice, once in the heart and once in the face, dying on the spot. The chain of events leading to McPhail's death began the night before, when Davis attended a pool party in Savannah's Cloverdale neighborhood. As Davis and his friend Daryl Collins left the party, a drive-by shooting broke out between unknown individuals and a group of teenagers. Michael Cooper, an innocent bystander in a passing car, was shot in the jaw. Davis and Collins then made their way to a nearby pool hall and eventually ended up in the parking lot of a Burger King, where they encountered Sylvester "Red" Coles arguing with Larry Young over a bottle of alcohol. At some point, Young was struck with a gun, but he couldn't identify his attacker. Minutes later, as Officer McPhail intervened, someone opened fire, and just like that, the young officer's life was ended. Coles quickly went to the police and pointed the finger at Troy Davis, telling them he saw Davis with a .38 caliber revolver and that Davis had assaulted Young. What Coles failed to mention, however, was that he too owned a .38 caliber weapon and had been present during the altercation. Not only that, Coles later claimed he had lost the weapon, which meant it was never tested. Within hours of being named, Davis had left town for Atlanta, reportedly to stay with his sister. Police raided his home, but found no weapon, just a pair of shorts in a dryer. On August 23rd, after a few days of negotiations, prompted by his family's fear for his safety, Troy Davis turned himself in. He was charged with the murder of Officer Mark McPhail. At Davis's trial in 1991, the case seemed to be airtight, at least on the surface. 34 witnesses were called by the prosecution, 7 of whom testified they had seen Davis shoot Officer McPhail, and 2 others claimed Davis confessed the killing to them. Davis, along with 5 other witnesses, testified in his own defense. No physical evidence linked Davis to the crime. The murder weapon was never found. No fingerprints or DNA tied him to the scene. However, ballistic experts argued that bullets found near McPhail's body matched those from an earlier shooting Davis had been allegedly involved in. That was enough for the jury. Davis was convicted of murder and several lesser charges and was sentenced to death in August 1991. What followed was a 20-year legal battle marked by doubt, appeals, and an international outcry. Davis maintained his innocence until his dying breath. Over the years, cracks began to show in the prosecution's case. 7 of the 9 key trial witnesses either recanted or significantly changed their testimony, many claiming they had been coerced by police during the original investigation. Several implicated Coles as the real shooter, but crucial pieces of evidence, such as Coles's alleged confession, were dismissed as hearsay because Coles was never subpoenaed by the defense to confront or confirm it under oath. Davis's case gained traction around the world. Human rights groups like Amnesty International and the NAACP rallied to his cause. Former President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict XVI, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Reverend Al Sharpton, and even former FBI Director William Sessions publicly urged for a new trial, or at least a full evidentiary hearing. Despite this, Davis's execution was scheduled multiple times: July 2007, September 2008, and October 2008. Each time a stay of execution was granted at the last minute. Then, in 2009, the U.S. Supreme Court took the rare step of ordering a federal court in Georgia to consider whether new evidence could clearly establish Davis's innocence. An evidentiary hearing was held in June 2010. The defense submitted affidavits from 7 witnesses who had originally implicated Davis, claiming they had lied or been pressured. Some said Coles had confessed to the killing, but in a ruling later that year, the court rejected the new evidence, declaring that Davis's attempts to overturn his conviction were largely smoke and mirrors. The judge concluded that the new witness statements lacked credibility or failed to meet the high bar set by the Supreme Court. By 2011, nearly 1 million people had signed petitions urging the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles to grant Davis clemency. The board refused. On September 21, 2011, the Supreme Court denied a final appeal. That night, after 20 years of incarceration and 4 execution dates, Troy Davis was put to death by lethal injection. He maintained his innocence even as the poison entered his veins. In his final words, he looked directly at the family of Officer McPhail and said, "I did not personally kill your son, father, brother. I am innocent. The incident that happened that night is not my fault. I did not have a gun. I am innocent. May God have mercy on your souls. May God bless your souls." Willie Jasper Darden. Willie Jasper Darden, Jr.'s life began in hardship and ended in controversy. His name etched into the history of the American death penalty, not just for the crime he was convicted of, but for the storm of legal, racial, and moral debates his case ignited. Born on June 1, 1933 in Greene County, North Carolina, Darden came into a world steeped in poverty and struggle. His mother, only 15 at the time, died giving birth to another child 2 years later. His father, an auto mechanic, tried to keep the family afloat, but the weight of poverty pulled young Willie from the classroom to the cotton fields. He dropped out after the 8th grade, his early life shaped more by survival than opportunity. By his teenage years, Darden's path was marked by repeated encounters with the law. His first arrest came at 16 for stealing from a mailbox. The years that followed were riddled with stints in and out of prison for assault, forgery, theft, and even an attempted essay of a 70-year-old woman in 1968, for which he was serving a 20-year sentence when the crime that would seal his fate occurred. He had been temporarily furloughed from prison when, on September 8, 1973, a robbery at Carl's Furniture Store in Lakeland, Florida, ended in the murder of store owner James Carl Turman and the shooting of 16-year-old Philip Arnold. Turman's wife was also reportedly the target of an attempted sexual assault during the incident. Later that day, Darden was pulled over for a traffic violation and taken into custody. While he sat in jail, police connected him to the robbery and the murder, and he was charged accordingly. What followed was a trial that would later be condemned for its racially biased underpinnings. Darden, a black man, was tried by an all-white jury, an outcome not by accident, but by design. Prosecutors had systematically excluded black jurors from serving, a practice that wouldn't be ruled unconstitutional until over a decade later. The state's attorney, C. Ray McDaniel, inflamed racial prejudice in the courtroom, likening Darden to an animal and musing he should be blown away by a shotgun. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun would later denounce the trial's fairness, pointing to the tainted jury selection and racially charged language used by the prosecution. Eyewitness testimony was central to Darden's conviction, but even that raised red flags. None of the 3 key witnesses, Turman's wife, Arnold, and a neighbor, were ever asked to identify Darden in a lineup. Their courtroom identifications were inconsistent and shaky. Arnold described the shooter as significantly larger than Darden, and Turman's wife struggled to pick him out. Despite this, no effective challenge was mounted by Darden's defense attorneys, who also failed to call a key alibi witness, Christine Bass. Bass later stated in an affidavit that Darden was at her home between 4 and 5:30 p.m., a time that conflicted with police estimates of when the murder occurred. Further, a minister who had been called to the crime scene claimed he arrived at 5:55 p.m., suggesting the shooting may have occurred while Darden was still at Bass's home. Despite the inconsistencies, the suppressed testimony, and the racially fraught courtroom atmosphere, Darden was convicted on January 23, 1974, and sentenced to death. He would spend the next 14 years on death row in Florida State Prison, becoming one of the longest-serving inmates awaiting execution at the time. Over the years, international human rights groups, legal experts, and activists rallied around his case, raising urgent questions about the fairness of his trial and the evidence used to convict him. Marion Bowman, Jr. On the morning of February 17, 2001, authorities in Dorchester County, South Carolina, responded to a horrifying scene, one that would haunt the community for years to come. Inside the trunk of a burned-out car lay the charred remains of 21-year-old Candy Louise Martin, a young mother whose life had been violently and senselessly taken. The discovery shocked investigators, but as they unraveled the events that led to Candy's brutal murder, the horror only deepened. Just one day earlier, Candy had crossed paths with Marion Bowman, Jr., a 20-year-old man with a volatile past. Bowman was riding with his sister when he spotted Candy and her group of friends. They had known each other in high school, and Bowman asked his sister to pull over so he could speak to her. Witnesses later recalled that Bowman demanded money from Candy. When she told him to wait until she was done talking, he lashed out with an ominous warning, "That bitch be dead by dark." It was a chilling prophecy, one that would come true before the day ended. That evening, Candy drove to a house where Bowman and some of his friends had been drinking. It seemed like a casual visit, but something far darker was in motion. Bowman and his cousin, James Tywin Gadsden, got into Candy's car, and the three drove off toward a secluded area that Bowman had specifically chosen. According to Gadsden's later testimony, as they neared the location, Bowman confided in him. He was planning to kill Candy. When they got out of the car, Candy walked slightly ahead of them. Without hesitation, Bowman pulled out a gun and fired 3 shots at her back. Miraculously, Candy was still alive. Bleeding and terrified, she turned to face Bowman and pleaded with him. She begged for her life, telling him she had a child to care for, but her cries for mercy fell on deaf ears. Bowman raised his gun again and fired twice more, ending Candy's life in cold blood. After the murder, he dragged her lifeless body into the woods. But even then, he wasn't done. What followed was a gruesome attempt to cover up the crime. Bowman warned Gadsden not to tell anyone what had happened, though in a disturbing contradiction, he also bragged to others, including a man named Hiram Johnson, about what he had done. That night, Bowman continued to use Candy's car as if nothing had happened. He even tried to sell the vehicle at a local club, but when no one was interested, he simply drove it around with friends, Candy's body still hidden nearby. Later, Bowman enlisted the help of another friend, Travis Felder, and together they returned to the remote location. Candy's body was still lying in the woods. Bowman dragged her out, shoved her into the trunk of her own car, and set the vehicle on fire. As the flames consumed the evidence, he confessed to Felder that he had murdered her. Then, just like that, the two men fled the scene, leaving behind a smoldering shell of a car and a devastated future for Candy's family. In June 2001, Marion Bowman, Jr. was indicted by a grand jury for murder and third-degree arson, Under South Carolina law, the murder charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. The trial began on May 17, 2002, and Bowman faced both charges before a jury in St. George, located in Dorchester County. The defense team pushed back by questioning Gadsden's credibility. They argued that Gadsden had a motive to lie due to his plea deal, and even accused the investigators of planting the murder weapon. But the jury wasn't swayed. On May 24, 2002, after just 3 hours of deliberation, they found Bowman guilty on both counts. During sentencing, Bowman's lawyers urged the jury to spare his life, highlighting a deeply troubled upbringing. But the jury returned a unanimous recommendation for the death penalty. Bowman was sentenced to die for the murder of Candy Martin and received an additional 10 years for arson. Bowman, however, wasn't ready to accept his fate. Over the next 2 decades, he filed numerous appeals. In 2005, the South Carolina Supreme Court denied his direct appeal. In 2018, they dismissed another. Then in 2020, U.S. District Judge Terry Wooten rejected Bowman's federal appeal, which had argued that his conviction was the result of ineffective legal counsel and inconsistent witness testimony. Bowman's legal team even claimed that another person had confessed to the killing, but the courts were unconvinced. Finally, in August 2022, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld his death sentence, and later that year, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case, cementing Bowman's fate. He would be executed in 2025 at the age of 44. Raymond George Riles. Raymond George Riles lived longer on death row than anyone else in U.S. history, but his story is far more than a statistic. It's a haunting saga of untreated mental illness, racial disparity, and the slow evolution of the American justice system. Born on June 1, 1950 in Harris County, Texas, Riles came from a background plagued with instability. He dropped out of school after the 7th grade, but later earned a GED. Even as a young man, those around him said Riles was a little funny. He prayed in strange languages, referred to himself by other names, and displayed behavior that would later be interpreted as signs of severe mental illness. Multiple members of his family were involuntarily committed, and a judge would later confirm Riles's family had a long history of psychiatric issues. But Riles's troubling behavior soon bled into criminality. His juvenile record was filled with arrests, attempted rape, burglary, robbery. By his mid-20s, Riles was working as a truck driver, but trouble seemed to follow wherever he went. Then came December 1974, the crime that would define the rest of his life. Riles, along with accomplice Herbert Washington, went to John Henry Motors in Houston, Texas. Washington had previously purchased a used car from a dealer named John Thomas Henry, and the two men were angry over mechanical problems. Armed and agitated, they confronted Henry, demanding a refund of the down payment. Henry refused, offering instead to fix the car. That wasn't enough for Riles. He shoved Henry and then shot him in the head. As Henry lay on the floor, still clinging to life, Riles stood over him and demanded cash. Henry complied, handing over a roll of bills before slipping into unconsciousness and dying shortly after. From there, Riles and Washington didn't stop. They robbed a nearby grocery store manager and his wife at gunpoint, making off with about $1,800. Their flight from justice was short-lived. A high-speed police chase ended in a violent crash and a shootout. Washington was quickly apprehended after being shot in the hand, while Riles, wounded in the arm, broke into a nearby home. The homeowner, a campus police officer, managed to subdue him and apply a tourniquet before police arrived. Riles was charged with capital murder and sentenced to death in 1976. But his mental health unraveled further on death row. He experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. In 1985, he attempted suicide by setting his prison cell on fire, suffering severe burns. 1 year later, a scheduled execution was halted due to growing concerns about the fairness of the death penalty, particularly for black men like Riles convicted of killing white victims. Over the decades, his case attracted legal scrutiny. His original trial had been tainted. Prosecutors improperly introduced evidence from an unrelated crime, and the court failed to consider Riles's deteriorating mental health as a mitigating factor. Time and time again, he was found too mentally ill to be executed, but the death sentence still loomed over him. In February 2021, Riles's attorneys filed a new petition arguing that modern legal standards around mental health and sentencing had evolved since his 1970s trial. They asked the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals for a new punishment hearing. The court agreed. On June 9th, nearly 47 years after the murder of John Henry, Raymond Riles was formally sentenced to life in prison, removing him from death row at last. In January 2025, he was denied parole. Some committed unimaginable acts, while others may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the system continues to evolve, one question still burns. How many more men are feared, not for what they've done, but for who they are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.